coming on the show. Shannon and Darren. I really wanted to call you Sharon there for a second, mix the two names together.
Don't worry.
But thanks for being on the show, doing our little drive around while we do the interviews. And it's great to have you. And we were just talking about drive and stick, so I think we should, props to drive and stick, right? I really miss it. But we're in the electric Ford Mach-E, right? And, the electrics I don't think really work if you don't have a stick.
Transmission?
I don't even know what. Yeah, exactly. Magic happens somehow. So what I wanted to talk to you about, of course, is Acorn. What are you all up to over there?
Yeah, so we just released Acorn. We just publicly announced it. August?
Yeah, just like a month or two ago.
Yeah. So Acorn is focused on the application experience on Kubernetes. So basically making it easier for people to package up applications and run them on Kubernetes. So something the developers can like and use,
right?
And something the ops people can also like and run. So It's like trying to make both sides happy. So that's kind of the high level of Acorn.
And so what does it do that makes it easier for developers?
Yeah, so it starts from a developer perspective. It starts a lot more towards a Docker-like experience. So we're big fans of Docker, kind of the original Docker from way back when. So it has more of like a compose-like experience. So there's something called the Acorn file to describe the application. So it can do a full microservice with volumes and secrets, and so you define the entire application.
Gotcha.
But then you can build that with Acorn into a single asset, like an OCI artifact that gets pushed into a standard registry.
Yep.
And then so from there, once it's in it's a image basically. Then you can just deploy that on any Kubernetes cluster, and then just run that on a Kubernetes cluster.
Gotcha.
So we have a little Acorn operator that runs on the Kubernetes cluster to assist that.
And is there like a registry or something, or like where do you push it?
So it just goes to any Docker registry.
Okay.
So we're using all the regular OCI Docker technology. So it's the standard stuff.
Yeah.
So the same way, like today you're building Docker images and pushing them to a registry. So now you build Acorn images for your application and then push those to a registry. And so your Acorn image actually includes like the application metadata plus all of the, it links in all of the Docker images.
Yep.
So it creates one big artifact that you can sign that defines your entire application. And then you can move that between like dev, test, prod, whatever you want. Yeah.
So what's particularly funny about your story is, have you ever heard of an application or a project called Atomic App?
A little bit.
So I worked on that in 2013.
Oh yeah.
Which did what you're describing. Probably not as well, right? But it was the same kind of concept as like ours was slightly different in that what we wanted to do was more like the container that you pushed around was a description of the application, and so then it would go and kind of get the pieces because we weren't sure we wanted the big thing. And to be fair, right, like it never saw a customer. Like we just kind of rolled. We're building it, and because we thought it was a problem in the space.
So one of the things that's unique what we do is because we don't actually copy in the Docker images. We're just because an OCI registry is really just a links to a bunch of digests.
Right.
So we just link to the existing Docker image digest. But if you do kind of a push or pull, since it's all linked together, it kind of appears as one asset. But it's just this big tree of layers and manifests and indexes. And so we link it all together.
And so you can sign it, which is super awesome.
And then also if you want to because a lot of times, let's say you're moving to an air-gapped environment or something, it's really easy to just pick up that one asset, and then because it looks like an asset even though it's all these links. And then just kind of push and pull that, so you get your whole application, so you don't have to deal with because that's what you can do that already with the Helm chart. You can push that to a registry, but it will not. It doesn't include all the Docker images. So then you have all these references to different images.
You have to go follow.
And then those might be mutable tags, so things have changed.
Right.
But one of the key things that we've done with Acorn is because there's been a lot of efforts to kind of address the developer experience on Kubernetes, but we're trying to embrace the full power of Kubernetes, but present it in a way that the actual developers, whoever's building the application, does not need to know Kubernetes.
Right.
So we're not using Kubernetes style YAML. We actually have kind of our own markup language. Looks a lot like Q or JSON it.
Oh, okay.
But it's something really tailored much towards it's more abstracted concepts. So it's like you just deal with kind of describing the application, and then Acorn just turns in all the Kubernetes stuff.
Right.
So we're not like, you're not going to see like, Kubernetes manifests and stuff in our in Acorn.
Your descriptions.
Yeah.
So does it feel more like, I mean, I think part of the appeal of a Docker file, right, was that it's basically Bash, right?
Yeah. And so it's like we mimicked it. It's like very, very. So we have the Acorn file is like, the level of abstraction is very similar to Docker components.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's like you're just defining some containers with image and arguments, and those use some volumes and secrets. But like under the hood, it's using all the, it's like
the real
deployments
and
PVCs and all the ingress and services. And so we just wire up everything kind of like best practices.
Yeah.
While just kind of respecting the kind of the intent of what the Acorn file, like the way they describe the application.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a pretty high bar. I mean, if you think about like Kubernetes works great. Helm works great. It's not like people can't do everything.
Yeah.
Our whole principle is, okay, can we make this way easier? Can we make this way easier for a lot more people? And and at the same time, it's like, how do you avoid all the mistakes of all the PaaSes that have come before? Because at some level, that's what we're building, right? It's a new PaaS. It's another layer of abstraction that takes away Kubernetes, and that's typically been really hard to get right. I mean, you've got Heroku's and Cloud Foundries and even early OpenShifts and stuff that were very, PaaSy. And for the most part, we saw most people migrating towards just give me Kubernetes, give me, give me native Kubernetes, give me Helm. But nowadays, when you go, we were at Rancher for 8 years and working with so many of these companies that had built Kubernetes, were managing Kubernetes in the cloud, had Kubernetes everywhere. The platform teams were building these massive, effectively platform as a service themselves, right? Helm templates and scanning and GitOps and all this stuff, and everyone was a snowflake. Everyone was heavily maintained. So I think our inspiration was, what if we did an open source project that anybody could use that sort of simplified that whole process and was continuously being maintained and just got better and better over time. And
I mean, in a lot of ways, right? It's, it's kind of like the beauty of like Ansible, right? It's like, it feels in the same way, is that like, we're not, versus like Puppet and Chef, is like, we're not saying, you can't get down and dirty and do whatever it is you actually need to do, because you've got some bizarre use case. But if we give you a framework to put it in, maybe the overall infrastructure will be a lot cleaner.
Well, the administration, right? What we found is like just upgrading clusters. People are so afraid of what is in there. And whether it's, and that was, I think, one of the things Darren really got right, and we've been getting really good feedback on just the sort of secure by design architecture of Acorn. Like, okay, let's make secrets super easy so that everybody's going to use them in exactly the right way. Let's, not allow privileged containers. Let's, automatically allocate namespaces, and just really just think about the best practices and build those again into a way that, we've been supporting thousands and thousands of Kubernetes clusters, and it just is like, well, if people just wrote their apps like this, it'd be a lot easier for us as operators. And I think that's what we're trying to get right with Acorn.
Well, I think it's one of those things too, where it's like, I still don't really understand why PaaSes didn't stick around, because like, I think there's a tendency amongst engineers, right, to think that their thing is somehow special, and to then therefore, avoid things that feel like they have lock-in, like a PaaS, right? So I think maybe you're kind of hitting that sweet middle ground where it's like, they feel like they can be a special snowflake, but because they're probably not actually going to be, you can actually capitalize on similarity of infrastructure and deployment.
That's it. You nailed it, because it really is that part where people are so afraid that something cool is going to come along later that they're not going to be able to use. And I think nowadays, though, what's interesting is when we're thinking about where Acorn's going, the cloud services are going to probably be the most important part of that, because everyone wants access to these cloud data services, right? The different types of, whether it's for machine learning or it's just a back end, Mongo, they want Atlas, right? They want access to these services. And I think it's going to be less and less important. Like as a platform, I don't think we'll be doing data services the way that Cloud Foundry did. We'll be doing data services where we just assume that you're using cloud-based data services. If you don't want to deploy, it's like you can choose to use the Mongo image and bring up a Mongo server, but you're probably just going to use, certainly more and more we expect people to use cloud-based databases. And so
it's really interesting with my students is that, because they're taking a computer science degree, and in a lot of ways it's very traditional. And, and so we do all these projects for like third parties. And so both the third party, squirrel trying to die this time. I've almost killed a seagull and a couple of geese.
Please do not kill a squirrel with us in the crowd.
Right, I haven't actually done anything bad.
Bad branding.
Yeah.
Yes.
In getting to look, so the client will present I basically want to make a website, right? Yeah. And getting them to try to maybe think a little bit outside of the box, for lack of a better term, but it's like, no, this one system, for example, it's message banking for ALS patients, right? Or vaguely like that. And I'm like, no, what this can be is a serverless function that you upload these audio files, and then, basically there's a pipeline of where we can like interject audio editing of various sorts. We can either use a human, in the mix, right, where we have an actual audio engineer, or we can go out to some service, but kind of getting them to wrap their head around, essentially cloud native development, right? Yeah. Or even event driven architectures, when what they think of is this very serial or sequential development style is really difficult, for me at least, I think what you're kind of describing, like that is what we're going to be doing for all development in the future, right? It's like, I'm going to write my one little bit, turn it into a serverless function, and it's going to get all of its data services, all of its file storage, everything else from somewhere else, magic happens here. I don't know.
And I think when you imagine that future, though, you kind of realize, that, of course, we're not going to have the same types of paths as we had in the past.
Right,
to do this right, you've got to kind of reimagine the whole thing. And it's a high bar. It's something that, you're going to have to actually appeal to users. So we're just in that, right now we're kind of in the alpha phase of Acorn. We haven't pushed out. We're just demoing here at KubeCon for the first time, a cloud service that ties the Acorn experience to all the infrastructure stuff that hopefully will grow into what we build, and we'll be able to start sharing with people. But
so I was curious, have you seen a project called, the nickname is Sochi, but it's streaming OCI? I was just talking to Chris Short. He was one of my earlier interviews. He was talking about this project that they contributed to CNCF as Amazon, but it does, it streams the layer getting of containers, which I think might be really appealing to the delivery system for.
Oh yeah, so it's that's like it's a newer version of like the snapshot or the E-star or whatever.
Yeah, but basically it's like kind of in the background it'll load all the layers rather than kind of having to get them all at once.
Yeah, that's some really cool work there.
But it seems like it might be really appropriate that you can kind of, then you can kind of get piecemeal, and then especially if you end up with an environment that is very PaaS-like, you have your PHP and your Python backends or whatever, but then if they have a shared sense of those Acorn files, or a lot of it, right, then you could also take advantage of the infrastructure optimization. I don't know, I just think it'd be kind of cool.
No.
But
it is. I mean, a lot of it right now, it's these cloud services too that are getting into, when we start to get requirements from people, a lot of them are about, look, everyone's got OpenShift or Rancher, and they've got all their cloud, they've got all sorts of Kubernetes, and they've done a lot. I mean, they've just done so much work, like so much work on OPA, so much work on Helm, so much work on building around it, that I think that's going to be one of the big, why I say the bar is so high. It's like, can you actually
give enough value to replace all that work.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like, wow, I mean, that sounds interesting, but how much am I, I've already got this thing sort of working. So
yeah, I mean, I had a very similar experience when I was working at Red Hat, right? Because I would go to customers and see the massive infrastructure they had built to build RPMs. And I was like, there's this open source project over here that does this already. You could have just used that one. And when I wasn't being facetious, I would, they would explain, oh no, we needed to do this weird thing over here, or we had this little part over there, and the system that builds RPMs for Red Hat, which is the same one as the open source one, right? It was written way back in the day, and it was really custom to what Red Hat needed, right? And so I think what you're trying to do is really interesting, but also I totally recognize it, like super difficult.
That's always what we try to do. It's always something.
Exactly. One of the things about like PaaS that's always been, kind of the restrictive nature of the, it's great you can just push some source code and it builds and goes to production. but it's like everyone has a slightly different flow in how they do CI and CD. There's different points they need to inject. They do this. So it's like, with Acorn, we were basically what we focused on is the easy way to basically build an asset, and then once you have that asset, you can easily move it around and deploy it. So you can really customize the CI and CD flow. Because those things, it's like CI, for example, is GitHub Actions. Like that's just taking off like crazy. So it's like, well, that's a pretty good tool. Like, people are using that. There's no reason to replace that and have to be stuck into like our specific view of how CI is supposed to be done.
I think that's the truth a lot of levels too, because like you really think about, to build Cloud Foundry, the team had to go build Bosch, right? Like they had to build basically Kubernetes. They had to do they had to build all of Kubernetes and then all of a platform on top of Kubernetes. And it's the same for Heroku. They had to build all of that. It's one of the reasons.
OpenShift.
It's like exactly. It's like to do it, you had to be experts at infrastructure and expert at development. And it's kind of cool to do it right now because we don't have to think about infrastructure. It's like we don't even really have to think about dealing with on-prem infrastructure. There's so many ways to get it.
The beautiful thing, like so with Acorn, it's like we're just focusing on like how do we take all of the Kubernetes ecosystem, like all these amazing things that are already there, and just basically put that together in a nice, like make it very accessible to people, make it very easy for the developer, make it very easy for operations. So it's like things like, it's like, oh, you want progressive delivery. It's like Acorn, we don't have to do progressive delivery. I mean, it's like that already exists. Flagger, you can pick up some run. It's like everything. It's like the ecosystem is so rich. It's like, so it's like we just need to plug into that. We're just basically trying to, it's like we have all this functionality, but people just struggle today in leveraging all of that. So it's like just make it easier, bring it all together.
So actually, kind of on that note, like one of the challenges I think in working as an engineer or a developer in the open source world is knowing which projects I should invest in, right? Because there's often a competition going on. Should I invest in Mesos or Kubernetes, right?
Way back when.
And so do you? Because as far as I'm concerned, part of providing a better developer experience is how do you recommend stuff, or do you recommend stuff as part of Acorn?
Yeah, so that's the idea of like, so with the Acorn and the Acorn files, we're trying to abstract the actual, so you're just describing the application and higher level concepts. So then at runtime, at like when we actually deploy the application, we can make those choices. So it's like Acorn, we have a default set of technology, but we are not looking to like prescribe you have to use this. So it's like we'll be doing like service mesh integration. So if you want Linkerd versus Istio, that's fine. They both provide.
But the user shouldn't know.
Yeah,
like, if I'm a user, I shouldn't know whether I've got Linkerd or Istio.
Right.
As long as the end output function is there, and what I need from that service mesh, is more like exactly. It's auto scaling or it's blue green or whatever it is, Canary. I have a structure that I'm looking for, so we want to implement those structures, and that's why it's like. This is opinionated by its core. It's like if we're not opinionated, we're really going to be just making the same mistakes. I think we're just going to create another thing on top of Kubernetes that doesn't add any value.
You think of XKCD's, yet another
one.
Whatever it is.
And that's
not policy, but
it's
protocol.
Like, and people have tried. There's so many people have tried this application layer of trying to get it right. So the bar's hard. We'll see.
Well, but I do like. I will say, I really appreciate getting things that are opinionated, and working with things that are opinionated. As long as if I can figure out how it's like well documented about how I can kind of do something slightly different, where I can't for whatever reason agree with your opinion.
And that's the great thing. So it's like by us, because like when we built Acorn, it's like so the user experience is really through a CLI, and it looks a lot like kind of Docker, like run and build and. But under the hood, it's 100% Kubernetes architecture, completely following all the best practices how you build things. So the nice thing is that we can make it work automatically, but for all of those corner cases where enterprise like, no, I need to do this, I need to do that, or whatever. It's like it's Kubernetes. You can still plug in under the hood, but again, that's all on the kind of the operations side, the infrastructure. It's all that's an implementation detail of
Well, and particularly what like you haven't really mentioned it, but it should be obvious, right? Which is that when I have a change in my operational environment, I also don't need to hassle the developers, right? You can just go and we've decided we want to go with this other route for this part of the product platform, so we can just change that and kind of redeploy, right?
And our guess is I think over time that those will become less and less, actually. Like I think probably the
there'll
closest,
be winners.
Well, and also I think the analogy in our head is we're trying to build something more like GitHub than like a sort of a deployment platform or framework.
Right.
Like we want something that's like, this is just a really, really easy way. If you use it, you don't have to think about any of that stuff.
Right.
And, hopefully it appeals to really micro users. Like it's like, I'd like someone who's one of your students to be able to come in there and be like, oh, this is sweet. Just boom, run, deploy. I pointed at my EKS environment or my DigitalOcean
Well, you're in
environment.
that really weird, I think it's a really weird kind of marketing position, which in some ways Rail also had, right? Which is that, like, your target audience is developers, but you have to make sure the operators are not afraid of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
exactly.
And I think that's a really, that's a really tough spot to get right.
I think that's an area where our experience at Rancher helps so much. Is having built for so many enterprise Kubernetes platforms, we kind of know what they need and what they don't need and what they care about. So it helps a little bit having that background.
Yeah.
Right.
But not, these days I really think more and more we're going to be deploying against cloud-based Kubernetes. Like that's what's going to be the vast majority of the back ends.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize, you're like, okay, if everything is, if we're going to see 80% of the workloads running on, GKE, EKS, AKS, digital, anyone's hosted Kubernetes service, then, really, I wonder how much their opinions are going to shape this as well as they make choices and they make set defaults. I think that will certainly be one of the key influences on the directions we take, because
that's what it's like. For a lot of these things, I don't so much see that there's going to necessarily be like a winner in the technology, but it's like if you're in AWS, you're going to be using their storage, their networking, their mesh capability, their security scanner, whatever. If you're in Google, so it's like a lot of these things are just going to be tailored to the environment, whatever makes sense. If you're on-prem and using OpenShift, it's going to be all Red Hat technology.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a term yet, but I really feel like it should be, which is essentially cloud locked. Because you really do kind of get locked into those the various clouds because of the services they offer based, and you kind of make that initial decision.
But I mean, I don't like. I think that you're still with Kubernetes getting the.
That's the kicker, right?
Because it's like, well, here I use their version of all this stuff, but it's still a standard
that
approach.
I can port.
So it's like, because we see that, because it's like when we were doing K3S and stuff on the edge, it was like people love the idea of like, I can use a Kubernetes, like I can develop as though I'm running it on the cloud, but it's going to the edge because it's just Kubernetes there.
Right.
Even though it's like, my application is obviously not portable from the edge to the cloud, like I'm not going to do that. It didn't make any sense, but like it's the same approach across, different teams or within a company.
And it's just like Linux sort of taking over the world. I think now we're in the stage where Kubernetes is taking over.
Right.
It becomes this ubiquitous backwind. It doesn't matter if you're in China and you're working on Ali Cloud, or you're in the US and you're working on AWS. I mean, everywhere you go, you're going to get Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to have more or less the same core capabilities. And I think the nice thing is, when we look at it, we're like, well, if we go somewhere and they don't have a good service mesh option, we'll bring our own, right? If they do, we'll use theirs. And so I think it'll be more, the hardest part for us will be supporting back ends, right? It'll be like, okay, this is, putting the work into like really support it too, because we could try to do lowest common denominator, but that's never going to really fly. You got to get in there and just really make the experience on a cloud provider fantastic. And if we get enough traction, hopefully they'll help us. But initially, it's all on you.
It's like those things, like lowest common, like those solutions never work or whatever. And so it's like with Acorn, what we're really trying to do is separate into like application concerns versus like operations and infrastructure. And what you find so much of Kubernetes right now, of the kind of the ecosystem, it's very oriented towards operations.
Oh yeah, totally.
All the technologies, like the storage and networking and security and all this stuff, that's all like from a developer perspective. Yeah, like that's just a crap where it's like, well, that should just run. Like I don't want anything like to just run.
I'm not involved in that part.
So it's like leave Kubernetes to the the operations people who understand it, and then leave the app and that to the app teams.
Well, and I think that's I mean, to be honest, right? I think it's been one of the really good things about Kubernetes is that it's kind of enforcing that separation you're talking about. It's really starting to make it real. Like I don't know if either of you remember Delta Cloud. Which I had such high hopes for, but it was basically this library that would let you talk to any of the clouds at the time, which was basically AWS and
that was like libcloud and
way back.
There's like OpenStack days.
Before that, but it was part of it was to support OpenStack. So that people could bridge from Amazon to OpenStack. I think that was part of its original mission, but it didn't do a very good job. It did the lowest common denominator model, right, which I think is why it never really took off, because of that, you got to separate those two sets of concerns.
And that's what we saw, like with the OpenStack. That was the kind of a major flaw across the board with the OpenStack, was that they were trying to abstract, and like every vendor who wanted to differentiate, they're doing the lowest common denominator. And that's what so that's the kind of the beauty. It's like Kubernetes is just, the architecture is so good that like everyone's been able to kind of come in and do their differentiated features and whatnot, but all still playing within the same space, like the same ecosystem. And so, it's like that. This is why. So it's like we're not looking to, kind of abstract that and do lowest common denominator. It's like, no, you take advantage of the, if you have this super great networking or AI system or something like that, you take advantage of it, and Kubernetes allows it.
Right. Yeah. No, it's really very cool. I will definitely be checking it out. Like I kind of heard the name of the company and what you were trying to do, but it's really been interesting to hear.
Especially for education, that, because I've seen like how quickly like college student stuff can pick up with like Docker and get it's like, since it has a similar user experience and everything, you can install Docker desktop and then be running an Acorn app right away.
Right.
So it's like it's as simple to get going as like Docker Compose.
Right.
But it's the big difference between like what we're doing with Acorn and say Docker Compose is like
there's no intermediary step.
Yeah, we're connecting you still to the full Kubernetes ecosystem. That thing you can you don't have to switch to a different tech stack to then put it into production.
Right.
Like this is the same thing you can do on your laptop. The same thing can run out in the cloud.
Which is, as if you've ever done any real production apps, is a very nice thing.
Oh yeah. And we know. I mean, it's like, so you switch to Helm, and then then you're doing Go templating, and yeah.
Well, and at least part of it too for me is like you do the deployment type development work so rarely that you have to relearn it every single time you do it. It's like every time I want to stand up an Apache and put a new web server in there, right? I have to remember how and figure out how to like rewrite the config files to get it to work, because you just don't do it often enough to memorize it.
That's how it's going to be for most people with Kubernetes, right? It's like if you're on it. I was talking something the other day, and there were like 5-person team, of which 2 of the people were just working on the Kubernetes deployment element, and the other 3 were doing the application. You're like, is that the overhead? Is it 40% overhead is what we kind of cost right now for sort of like...
Well, I mean, I have the problem, right? Because I mean, I teach most of the time, but I fool around developing, various bits, and I want to go, and I've been messing with Tecton for one of the learning paths for Cube by Example, and and it's like I have to relearn all this stuff, and and it's a whole different style of even pattern of development, right? Because it's the the more the promised style of development, and so it's like completely different. So yeah, I really appreciate that sort of thing.
It's like when we talk about like computer languages, there's like something that's simple like C, where you can keep the whole language in your head, versus like C++, where it's like, it's this large, it's kind of like Kubernetes is a lot more like a C++. It's like you can't possibly memorize all of the things that they get. So it's like me.
I compare it to Python. Let's not talk about C++.
We won't have to go as far as C++.
Well, also, do you really want to be labeled as like C++ ever?
Exactly.
But Python is just as big.
Well, I used to compare it to Java a lot.
Oh,
that would really upset people.
Right.
But the thing is like because I've been using Kubernetes, obviously day in day out for the last however long it's been around.
Yeah.
I still cannot from scratch write like a deployment, or I could not actually okay, I'm going to set up like a deployment with a config map and a service. I couldn't do that from scratch. I got to find some template or something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Although to be fair, right? I mean, like for the vast majority of almost anything I do that's related to like programming or whatever, I almost always start with something else and then hack it until it's right.
Yeah. But that was one of the things I always liked about like Docker and Docker Compose was like it was simple enough that for the most part, like after you could memorize it pretty quickly,
right?
And it was pretty straightforward.
And it was quick to look up the weird ones that you needed occasionally. Yeah,
there wasn't really.
Although I still would like someone to clearly explain to me the difference between CMD and entry point. But I get it, but I don't get it. So. I don't know. So what else? What are you doing at KubeCon? I mean, so you said you're demoing, an early version of the product.
Yep.
Are you giving any talks? Are you doing stuff like that?
We kind of were the last ones in. I mean, we booked a sponsor. We were like, all right, we should go to KubeCon about a month and a half ago, which was never a good idea. To find us, you just got to walk and walk, and walk
all the way at the back.
Just keep looking. You see a janitor, you went a little too far, but not much too far.
We know if you find us, you're really interested.
Dedicated, you know.
And the development team loves you with this. So by the way, you have a brand new deadline because we have to go and show it at a show.
Oh
Get ready.
Of course.
Oh, Darren never fails to deliver. I never even worry.
I was actually giving a talk of kind of demoing something or whatever, and my entire dev team was in the audience, and I was trying to demonstrate something. And I'm like, what am I doing wrong? Because you always get flustered on stage, and you figure you mistype something or whatever. Turns out there was a bug. They fixed the bug while I was on stage, and so when I went back to it later on, it worked. And so
I don't know what you're talking about.
I was like, am I losing my mind? Didn't I do exactly the same thing before? It was really very funny. Speaking of always being on time.
Yeah, man. Well, we've had our experiences. Darren and I have been hosting meetups online for 8 years together. And I would say, everyone, the only rule is we always do live demos and we always show real technology.
Yeah.
I don't know what our batting average is, but we would not be hired. We'd be double A at best. Never we'd make the majors. These things break all the time.
You know what's so interesting about that though is that so this is kind of gets at why. So we started this Twitch channel right around the pandemic, and programming on Twitch has been kind of growing in popularity. And my theory is that because one of the hardest, or one of the things you get from experience, right, is how to approach debugging, how to approach fixing a problem. And when you don't have any idea, what do you do, right? And so I think when you're watching somebody who's live programming and they're an expert, right, and they run into some problem, I think what's really interesting for the viewers, especially a junior developer, is how they approach fixing it. And you can watch them do it live, and so I bet there was actually a lot of people who appreciated when your demo.
We get lots of love.
You get super stressed
out. The best ones
are
they're no, you just misspelled that.
I get that in class all the time because I live code in class. So
sometimes I'll just stop. I'm like, did anyone see?
What did I do wrong? Why is this? It's worked in 100 times out of 100.
Right. Yeah. I basically do that every lecture. So yes, I know exactly.
It's the best though. I think people doing this is so valuable. It's also when somebody who's really good at this has been doing it for a long time screws up over and over again. It makes everyone feel wow, he's really not that good, or maybe we all just suck.
Right, exactly. Which is probably more likely the case.
If you ever need a boost of confidence, just watch my demos. They go so bad.
It will definitely make you really nervous to use any product he's built. But
exactly.
But really, go try Acorn. It's great. It's really great.
It's so easy. It works on the 8th try.
At least
every 8th try.
Yes.
It's consistent.
Yes. It's alpha. We'll fix it in beta.
Right. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun.
And,
thanks for having us. This is great.
You had a nice little tour of the town.
I saw a little bit of Detroit.
Almost killed the squirrel.
Almost killed the squirrel.
Yeah.
Didn't actually do it though. Like I said, my ratio is pretty good.
No animals harmed in the taping of this production.
Exactly. We think we might need that as a tagline because the number of times I've had geese meandering across in front of me.